How did Robert Burton apply scientific methods to his own mind?
Robert Burton, 1577–1640, spent most of his life at Oxford University, where he was vicar of St. Thomas Church. He was later appointed rector of Segrave, Leicester. He was a mathematician with interests in astrology and was known to be companionable and cheerful. However, he suffered all his life from a heavy heart and hatchling in my head. A kind of imposthume in my head, which I was very desirous to be unladen of. In the preface to the Anatomy of Melancholy, 1621, he explained the work as therapeutic. I write of melancholy, by being busy to avoid melancholy. There is no greater cause of melancholy than idleness, no better cure than business.
What are some highlights of Friedrich Hegel's career?
Hegel was the eldest of 3 children. His father was a minor government official in the Duchy of Wittenberg. His mother died when he was 11. He attended the theological seminary or Stift, which was a subsidiary of the University of Tübingen. His roommates were the great German Romantic poet Johann Christian Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. 1775–1854, who would be his colleague and intellectual opponent. They disputed the importance of reason, with Hegel proudly affirming it and Schelling expressing a lack of enthusiasm for it. When he graduated, Hegel first worked as a tutor for a Bern family, and then he moved to Frankfurt. His father's death provided him with sufficient income to concentrate on his own scholarly work in hopes of getting a university position. His early interests were in reconciling fluid notions of reason with non-institutionalized Christianity. In 1805, Schelling assisted Hegel in moving to Jena, where he lectured for several years and became a professor at the University of Jena. By this time, as expressed in his early essays, Hegel was having doubts about the freedom promised by the Enlightenment. He loved the thought and ways of life of ancient Greece and believed that Enlightenment rights would result in new forms of repression. One motivation for this concern might have been his experience of the French Revolution. On a deeper philosophical level, he thought that what was most noble in human beings required society and government for its development. This view conflicted with the individual rights doctrine, which assumed that government was the enemy of natural human rights. At Jena, he co-edited the Critical Journal of Philosophy with Schelling, which was dedicated to exploring the consequences of Immanuel Kant's, 1724–1804, transcendental idealism. In light of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, 1762–1814, and Schelling's own work, Hegel left Jena when the university closed after Napoleon Bonaparte's victory in October 1806. He then edited a pro-Napoleon newspaper in Bavaria. and became headmaster of a Nuremberg high school in 1808. In 1807 Hegel's important Phenomenology of Spirit was published. And then his Science of Logic, 1812, resulted in a professorship at Heidelberg. In 1818 he assumed his last post, which was as a professor at Berlin, lecturing widely on philosophy of history, history of philosophy, aesthetics, and philosophy of religion, much of which was unpublished until it was posthumously compiled from his notes and those of students. Hegel's Foundations of the Philosophy of Right, Natural Right and Political Science in Outline was published in 1821.
What does the Loch-Nozick solution leave out?
It doesn't account for how we can come to own both the parts of something we have mixed our labor with and the parts we haven't. How is it possible that in owning property which first became a commodity, because someone improved it, one comes to own the mineral rights to that property? Also, how do we decide when something is too big to mix our labor with, so that we cannot, as in Nozick's ocean example, come to own all of it?
How did Friedrich Nietzsche's life presage his philosophy?
The great irony is that in life Nietzsche was very unlike his heroes, either those of the aristocratic past that he so admired, or of the new age of knowledge and courage that he heralded. His life began in a somewhat sheltered way in Prussia. His father, a Lutheran minister and the son of a Lutheran minister, died when he was 4 of what the doctors called softening of the brain. His mother, Franziska, was only 18 when Friedrich was born. She was the daughter of a Lutheran minister. Contrary to Nietzsche's belief that his forebears were Polish noblemen, many of them were butchers. When Nietzsche was 6, his younger brother died, and he, his mother, and his sister moved to Naumburg. Nietzsche grew up in a household consisting of his mother and sister, his paternal grandmother, and 2 unmarried aunts. Biographers have remarked that this all-family environment was detrimental to his psychological health as an adult. They have referred to this environment in trying to make sense of the hostility Nietzsche displayed toward women in some of his writings, such as this from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883 to 1885. When thou goest to woman, take thy whip. At boarding school, Nietzsche suffered from migraines. He was inspired by the poetry of Johann Hölderlin, who had gone insane. So this was not considered a healthy subject by Nietzsche's teachers. Nietzsche studied theology and classical philology at the University of Bonn, but only philology at the University of Leipzig. He served briefly in the army from 1867 to 1868, and was discharged after a chest injury, which was incurred when he landed on the pommel of his saddle while mounting. When he was only 24, his teachers considered him so promising that he was appointed associate professor of classical philology at Basel. Nietzsche moved to Basel, became a Swiss subject, and, in 1869, a full professor. In 1870 he received leave to serve as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. Returning to Basel with both dysentery and diphtheria. He received his doctorate in 1873 and resigned from his academic position in 1879 for health reasons. After that, he continued to write and to travel for 9 years.
What was Berkeley's critique of Newtonian science?
Berkeley did not think that we can have an idea of absolute motion apart from particular things that move, or of absolute space, apart from specific distances. He thought that Newton's hypothesis of force and action at a distance might be useful for mathematical calculations, but that there were no grounds to posit it as a real entity.
Why were the Sophists important philosophically?
The Sophists do not have an august reputation, and their successors in ancient times, particularly Plato, had little praise for their contributions to philosophy. However, that assessment may not be altogether fair. Unlike the pre-Socratics, who concentrated on the natural, non-human world, the Sophists were interested in human nature and human affairs. The Sophists were the first humanists in Western philosophy. We should also keep in mind that much of their thought was opposed to the timeless wisdom prized by Plato. And much of how they were characterized comes from Plato. The Sophists were public intellectuals who popularized existing knowledge and wisdom, with some original modification. The subjects they addressed included grammar, theory of language, ethics, political philosophy and doctrines, religion, ideas about the gods, human nature, and the origins of humankind, literary criticism, mathematics, and last but not least, speculations about the natural world that had been developed by the pre-Socratics.
What were the ideas of some of the humanist existentialists?
Hans Jonas, 1903 to 1993, was influenced by phenomenology as well as existentialism. But some of his most original work has been directly relevant to environmental concerns and thought about the nature of life. In The Imperative of Responsibility, 1979. He argues for ethical responsibility for the planet to fight the incursions of technology. In The Phenomenon of Life, 1966, he argues against standard biological approaches that objectify living things and seek to explain their behavior via mere chemistry or mechanistic hereditary forces. Jonas' positive thesis is that all life forms, even single cells, have some form of awareness, and they strive from their own physicality and perspective on the world. Awareness on a cellular level does not imply the presence of the cogito a mind. It is sufficient if the living entity behaves in a way that enhances its life, or attempts to do so. Emmanuel Levinas, 1905–1995, was a French Jewish philosopher who was originally from Lithuania. Levinas criticized the philosophical tradition in which things other than an individual mind are represented to that mind in ideas or some other mental content. He thought that the paradigm for understanding consciousness was the face-to-face interactions between human beings. Such interactions are both particular and indescribable, as well as of inestimable importance. Levinas' main works are Totality and Infinity, 1964, Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. 1974, Difference and Transcendence, 1999, and Between Us, 1998. Albert Camus, 1913–1960, like Søren Kierkegaard, 1813–1855, had a burning question.
What was the dial?
The name for this publication was suggested by Amos Bronson Alcott. 1799–1888, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803–1882. The simile was explained in the first issue this way. And so with diligent hands and good intent we set down our dial on the earth. We wish it may resemble that instrument in its celebrated happiness, that of measuring no hours but those of sunshine. Let it be one cheerful rational voice amidst the din of mourners and polemics. Or to abide by our chosen image, let it be such a dial, not as the dead face of a clock. Hardly even such as the gnomon in a garden, but rather such a dial as is the garden itself, in whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived and arriving. The dial became dormant in 1844, but was revived for a year in 1860. In 1880 it reappeared as a political magazine, and in 1920 as a literary modernist magazine, publishing essays, poetry, and art reviews until 1929.
Who was Charles Hartshorne?
Charles Hartshorne, 1897–2000. Wrote over 20 books dedicated to developing the theological side of Whitehead's philosophy. Hartshorne posited a dynamic form of evolution that included human events, time, history, and God. God is dipolar. He has an abstract pole and a concrete one. Hartshorne thought that the necessity of God's existence could be proved in his version of St. Anselm of Canterbury's ontological argument. Hartshorne believed that Anselm was mistaken in attempting to prove the existence of God from thought, but that what can be proved is the necessity of God's existence. Hartshorne's major works are Beyond Humanism, Essays in the New Philosophy of Nature, 1968. The Logic of Perfection and Other Essays in Neoclassical Metaphysics, 1962, revised, 1973, Anselm's Discovery, 1965. A Natural Theology for Our Time, 1967, revised, 1992, The Philosophy and Psychology of Sensation, 1968. Creative Synthesis and Philosophic Method, 1970, Reality as Social Process, 1971, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. 1984, and Born to Sing, An Interpretation and World Survey of Birdsong, 1992.
What are primary qualities and secondary qualities?
The scientific distinction between primary and secondary qualities was to prove very important for subsequent philosophy. Primary qualities are size, shape, mass, motion, and quantity. Secondary qualities were color, texture, sound, and smell. It was believed that the primary qualities of atoms resulted in the secondary qualities that could be sensed by us in objects made up of atoms. That is, the world of our perception is made up of secondary qualities, which are formed by interactions between the atoms in objects and the atoms in our sense organs. Secondary qualities are exactly those qualities of sense such as color, sound, texture, and smell that make up our everyday experience. But the real world was made up of atoms.
What is epistemological rationalism?
Epistemological rationalism is the position that human beings have important ideas or principles present in their minds from birth, and that the most important truths about the world can be derived from thought, without the need for experience. These a priori truths are also held to be logically certain, which is to say that it would entail a logical contradiction to deny them, and that they are absolutely certain, or, in current terminology, true in all possible worlds.
For example, how is the mind connected to the body?
Most of us know that if we want to raise our right arm and we are not paralyzed, it is the easiest thing in the world to do. We just decide to do it and the arm goes up. But ever since the work of the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, philosophers have argued passionately among themselves about the right way to describe the connection between the mind and the body.
What was distinctive about Elizabeth Elstubb?
Elizabeth Elstubb, c. 1683 c. 1756, was the first professional scholar to compile an Anglo-Saxon grammar. In her introduction to an English-Saxon homily on the birthday of St. Gregory, 1709, she argued for the usefulness of educating women on the grounds that scholarly work itself was valuable.
How is sociology related to philosophy?
Social and political philosophers discuss society and criticize culture. Sociology is the science that can give them factual information about what they are discussing.
What was Schopenhauer like as a person?
Schopenhauer was willful, misanthropic, and misogynistic. In short, not much of a people person. While at the University of Berlin, he called Johann Fichte, 1762–1814, a charlatan. And he later wrote, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel are in my opinion not philosophers. For they lack the first requirement of a philosopher, namely a seriousness and honesty of inquiry. They are merely sophists who wanted to appear to be, rather than to be, something. They sought not truth but their own interest and advancement in the world. So much for men, in Schopenhauer's opinion. In his 20s, Schopenhauer experienced unrequited love for the mistress of the Duke of Weimar. He and his mother, a successful novelist, quarreled over his treatment of her guests and he never saw her again after age 26. Women, in general, he said, are directly fitted for acting as the nurses and teachers of our early childhood by the fact that they are themselves childish, frivolous, and short-sighted. In a word, they are big children all their life long, an undersized, narrow-shouldered, broad-hipped and short-legged race. They have no proper knowledge of anything, and they have no genius. Schopenhauer was also said to have abused at least one female servant. In his old age, he lived alone, except for a poodle.
What is Julia Kristova's idea of the object and the nature of women?
Kristeva has emphasized the rejection of mothers by both male and female children due to male-dominated cultural patterns that render the mother herself abject. Which is to say, totally other, disgusting, and monstrous. Kristeva thinks that the solution to this problem requires a rediscovery and healing of narcissism in women's psyches and an acceptance of adult love between women. However, Kristeva rejects the label woman as a universal term, and has refused to define women. She apparently believes that every woman is fundamentally different in how she is a woman or what being a woman means. As she wrote, it is there, in the analysis of her difficult relation to her mother and to her own difference from everybody else. men and women, that a woman encounters the enigma of the feminine. I favor an understanding of femininity that would have as many feminines as there are women. Kristova's main theoretical writings are, About Chinese Women, 1977, Desire in Language. A Semiotic Approach to Literature and Art, 1980, Powers of Horror, an Essay on Abjection. 1982, Revolution in Poetic Language, 1984, and New Maladies of the Soul, 1995.
What was social Darwinism?
Social Darwinism was an application of the Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest to inequalities and opportunities in contemporary 19th century society. It was an age in which the enterprising could amass large fortunes in a short period of time. Although they had to compete with other capitalists. And those who labored, often in unhealthy and exhausting conditions for barely enough pay to support themselves, also competed among themselves for available jobs. Social Darwinists wrote popular books, sometimes consisting of what today would be considered racist or class-based eugenics. And their claims made a strong impression on general readers. They shared a belief that competition was valuable in itself and that those who failed in life's contests failed a deeper test of evolutionary survival. Instead of social reform, their ideals were to encourage the traits that enabled success at competition by means of selective human breeding, as well as moral approval of the winners.
What is Fodor's language of thought hypothesis?
The language of thought and thinking, as a mental language, is a system of symbols in the brain. Its content are propositional attitudes such as, thinks that, desires that, intends that, believes that, hopes that, and so forth. Each attitude has a distinct computational relation to a representation. Computation is information processing based on syntax. As Fodor puts it, there is no computation without representation. Thus, having a belief is being in a computational relation to a representation, as is having a desire. Every primitive concept in thought has a neural symbol in the brain. The end result of this in behavior is that the representation that is a belief causes an individual to behave as if it were true. Whereas the representation that is a desire causes the individual to behave to make it true.
What is Julia Kristova's idea of the abject and the nature of women?
Kristeva has emphasized the rejection of mothers by both male and female children due to male-dominated cultural patterns that render the mother herself abject. Which is to say, totally other, disgusting, and monstrous. Kristeva thinks that the solution to this problem requires a rediscovery and healing of narcissism in women's psyches and an acceptance of adult love between women. However, Kristeva rejects the label woman as a universal term, and has refused to define women. She apparently believes that every woman is fundamentally different in how she is a woman or what being a woman means. As she wrote, it is there, in the analysis of her difficult relation to her mother and to her own difference from everybody else. Men and women, that a woman encounters the enigma of the feminine. I favor an understanding of femininity that would have as many feminines as there are women. Kristeva's main theoretical writings are, About Chinese Women, 1977, Desire in Language. A Semiotic Approach to Literature and Art, 1980, Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection. 1982, Revolution in Poetic Language, 1984, and New Maladies of the Soul, 1995.
What is the causal theory of meaning?
This theory was first developed by Paul Kripke, 1940. Keith Donnellan, 1931, and Hilary Putnam, 1926, in the 1970s. There used to be a distinction between denotative and connotative, or intentional, with an S, which is different from intention with a T, meaning. Denotative meaning was the thing or types of things in the world to which a word referred. Connotative or intentional meaning was the conditions of application of a word or the definition of the word in other words. According to the causal theory of meaning, also known as the causal theory of reference, there is a causal history that makes proper names the names of the individuals they are, something like a baptism. Natural kind terms, such as water and gold, work in much the same way. To take an example, the term water designates the natural H2O. If a substance were called water that was not H2O, it would not be water. Putnam famously said of meanings in this regard that they just ain't in the head. Articles by Kripke, Donnellan, and Putnam on this subject appear in Naming Necessity and Natural Kinds, 1977, edited by Stephen P. Schwartz.
Who was Hypatia of Alexandria?
A philosopher and educator who achieved lasting renown, Hypatia of Alexandria in Egypt, c. 350 to 415, became famous throughout intellectual communities for her abilities in Neoplatonist philosophy and mathematics. In the Neoplatonic tradition, Hypatia used mathematics as a path toward understanding the higher world. In Theon, Hypatia's father comments on Ptolemy's Almagest, which set forth the geocentric model of the universe, and he credits her for the work of Book 3. Although Hypatia was a pagan, the Roman Christian Egyptian government appointed her head of a school of Plotinus. Hypatia held that post for about 15 years, teaching both male and female students. She was said to have been very beautiful and was much admired personally. Sainte-Suze, c. 373 c. 414. Her pupil, who was to become Bishop of Tamame, conveyed her views in essays, hymns, and letters. She was the heroine of Charles Kingsley's 1853 novel, Hypatia, or, New Foes with an Old Face. Hypatia was associated with Alexandria's prefect, who was opposed by Saint Cyril of Alexandria. c. 378-444, the militant archbishop. As a result of her involvement in that dispute, Hypatia was hacked to pieces with sharp shells and her body burned by a mob of Christian monks. The contemporary feminist philosophy journal, Hypatia, is named after her.
How did feminist epistemology develop?
Nancy Codoro, 1944, showed in The Reproduction of Mothering, 1978. How social roles within the nuclear family are reproduced socially by girls. Identifying with their mothers and boys becoming unlike their mothers. Recognition of the social construction of female gender resulted in broad rejection of biological determinism of women's traditional roles. This cleared the way for feminists to seek social causes for the disadvantageous status of women. Carol Gilligan's, 1936, in A Different Voice, 1982, criticized Lawrence Kohlberg's account of moral development because it left out the relational nature of girls' moral perceptions. In contrast to the more abstract and individualistic nature of boys' moral development. The idea that women had relational identities led to an ethics of care, most notably based on Stanford University psychologist Nell Noddings Caring, 1982. Which was foundational for the work of Sandra Lee Bartka in Femininity and Domination. 1990, and Eva Kitte's Love's Labor, Essays on Women, Equality, and Dependence, 1999. Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason, Male and Female in Western Philosophy, 1984. Sparked a view that philosophy itself had been identified with distinctively masculine capabilities of reason to the intellectual as well as literal exclusion of women. These perspectives led to the articulation of feminist epistemology, stressing connected, rather than individual knowers, or people who learn and come to know things, and the role of emotion and action in knowledge. The collection of papers in Linda Alcoff, 1955, and Elizabeth Potter's, 1947. Edited work Feminist Epistemologies, 1993, relates some of this groundbreaking work to traditional epistemology. An additional development of feminist epistemology is feminist philosophy of science.
Did Plato and Aristotle influence early Christian and medieval philosophy?
Yes, but both early Christian and medieval philosophy were influenced by interpretations of Plato and Aristotle's thought, which neither they nor today's scholars would accept as completely true to the sources. This was because Plato was given a Neoplatonic interpretation, and Aristotle was interpreted through a Christian worldview. Not until the Renaissance did the intellectual complexity and humanism of ancient Greek thinkers begin to fully re-emerge, however. Until Aristotle's texts were rediscovered in the 9th century, Plato was the major influence from antiquity. Although many of his dialogues were lost, and until the Renaissance, all Greek or pagan philosophy took a distant second place to Christian theology and philosophy.
What are Zeno's paradoxes?
Zeno's paradoxes continue to occupy mathematicians and philosophers today. His paradox of motion applies to any distance. The paradox states that, before you can walk across a room, you have to travel half of the distance, one half, but before that, you must traverse half of that half distance. 1/4, and before that, half of that distance, 1/8, and so on. Because there are an infinite number of divisions of any given distance traveled, it is impossible to go anywhere from anywhere else. Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise applies a slightly different principle to a race. Suppose that Achilles, in a race with the tortoise, gives the tortoise a head start. Before Achilles can pass the tortoise, he must get to the place where the tortoise has been. But because the tortoise will always have moved on from that place, Achilles will never be able to pass the tortoise.
How did Montaigne convey his ideas?
Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, used an indirect approach to explaining his ideas, which was not surprising for someone as intellectually sophisticated about literature, philosophy, and history as he was. Montaigne translated Natural Theology, or, the Book of Creatures, written from 1420 to 1430, by Raymond Sebond, a 15th-century Spanish theologian, who had taught at the University of Toulouse, where Montaigne had studied. The University of Toulouse offered much advanced and humanistic thinking at that time in a curriculum that encouraged intellectual creativity. Montaigne's translation, The Apology of Raymond Sebond, was the result of Montaigne's original embellishments. His primary thesis was that sensory and intellectual knowledge are uncertain. His conclusion was that judgment should therefore be suspended concerning matters that go beyond experience. Along the way to that conclusion, Montaigne discussed many conflicts of opinion that were relevant to disputes current in his day.
Was social Darwinism a beneficial set of beliefs?
Most progressives thought not. First, Social Darwinism tended to accept, if not applaud, the suffering of the poor, as though it reflected their personal weakness rather than the structure of society. And second, social Darwinism evolved into a reactionary type of white supremacy. Toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, social Darwinism and its associated eugenics merged with white American racialist beliefs that would later be considered racist or discriminatory. For example, in 1916 amateur anthropologist and lawyer Madison Grant published The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History. Grant propounded a theory of Nordic superiority and argued for a public eugenic program to save the Nordics from being overrun by non-white racial groups. Grant's book sold 1,600,000 copies by 1937. It was widely influential in individual beliefs and public policy that restricted immigration from Asia and discriminated harshly against African Americans.
How did political events after the decline of Greece change philosophy?
The death of Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 B. CE, marked the end of the classical period in Greek philosophy. The Greek cities were unable to unify after great losses in the Peloponnesian War. 431 to 404 BCE. The next 800 years marked a period of great instability. As the political and cultural center of Western civilization shifted to Europe. As Rome came to dominate Greece, the uncontested brilliance of the Greeks faded into the past. Toward the end of this historical period, Christian thought and practice began to define almost every aspect of civilized life. Some pre-Socratic thought, particularly the ideas and practices of Pythagoras, lived on after the decline of Greece. Plato's work endured in new forms that were compatible with early Christianity. The Hellenistic or Greek-based forms of the new philosophies of skepticism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism spread throughout the Mediterranean world. There was little awareness of Aristotle's work at the time, although empiricism was easily accepted.
What is distinctive about the practice of analytic philosophy?
Analytic philosophy is as much a method as a set of traditional subjects. The method is a combination of empiricism and conceptual analysis, with as little speculation as possible.
What is Roman Stoicism?
Roman Stoicism was developed by Seneca the Younger, 1–65 c. E. Epictetus, c. 55–135 CE, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, 121–80 CE. Who wrote Meditations. Many were moved by Marcus Aurelius' advice about restraining anger at his weak subjects. Do not be turned into Caesar, or dyed by the purple, for that happens. Roman Stoicism was influential in the Renaissance and the modern period. And to this day it underlies codes of behavior and moral values in military communities. The basic Stoic premise is that we are obligated to understand the nature of the things we deal with and be prepared to accept, without fuss, unwanted events that are not under our control. Epictetus is famous for saying that if your favorite clay pot breaks, you should remember that it was always fragile and not yours to begin with. And if your spouse or child dies, that is a reminder that they are mortals. Something that we should always remember about the human beings we love.
Why is philosophy important?
Philosophical study of the natural world gave rise to the physical sciences of our day. Physics, astronomy, geology, biology, and chemistry. Although other cultures, for example, China, have had distinctive sciences and technology, Western technology, as a product of Western science, has had global predominance in the modern period. Philosophical study of the human world gave rise to the social sciences of psychology, history, political science, sociology, and anthropology, as well as linguistics and cognitive science. Of course, many theoretical ideas about the world remain in philosophy as metaphysics. And many human questions are still only considered in philosophy, insofar as it is part of the humanities. These human questions are of universal interest across cultures and in ordinary, practical, daily life.
What was John Dewey's metaphysics?
Dewey held that nature has different transactions, or kinds of action, that have mutual causes and effects between or among their components. Dewey's transactions are thus interactions. There are three evolutionary levels, or plateaus, of transactions: physiochemical, psychophysical, and human experience. Physiochemical reactions are simply what can be studied by physics and chemistry. Psychophysical transactions are connections between mind and body. Human experience is exactly how things seem to human beings as they go about their lives.
He wrote in Does Political Theory Still Exist?
It is seldom that there is only one model that determines our thought, men, or cultures. Obsessed at their models are rare, and while they may be more coherent at their strongest, they tend to collapse more violently when, in the end, their concepts are blown up by reality. By the same token, Berlin was not enthusiastic about harmony or agreement in political life. He believed that well-intentioned individuals could hold opposing values, resulting in inevitable moral conflict. These collisions of values are of the essence of what they are and what we are.
What did Hippias contribute to learning?
The sophist Hippias of Elis, c. 460 BCE, made a lot of money in his travels. He was polymathic, widely knowledgeable, and wrote poems, plays, histories, and speeches, as well as discussions of literature, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, the arts, ethics, and mnemonics. He made an important mathematical discovery of the curve used to trisect an angle, the quadratrix. He argued against pre-Socratic posits of hidden reality and advocated self-sufficiency as a virtue. In conflicts between nature and convention, he is said to have advocated following nature. This meant that if he felt like doing something, and there was a rule against it, he was in favor of doing that thing and breaking the rule.
What did George Berkeley mean when he said, "To be is to be perceived"?
In Berkeley's view of what exists in the world, there are only three things: minds, ideas, and God. Angels are also minds, and another way of dividing up the world is into spirits and ideas. Human beings, angels, and God are spirits. Everything else is ideas. Nothing else is known to exist. But if only spirits and ideas exist, how can there be a world? Berkeley thought that what we think of as an external world is just one idea added to our ideas of sense. No idea of sense can exist without being perceived by some mind. Berkeley's motto was esse est percipi, or, to be is to be perceived. The idea of an external world is an isolated idea in itself, but no more than an idea. Furthermore, many of the ideas that we think we have, which support the existence of external reality, are no more than special distinct ideas combined with ideas of sense. For example, the ideas reality and physical matter are just words to which nothing like an external world corresponds. At best, they are merely additional ideas. This doctrine that reality is just another idea, in Berkeley's sense, is what made him the philosophical idealist par excellence.
What did Zarathustra say in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra?
In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883 to 1885, Nietzsche presents the thoughts of his eponymous hero, who is named after the prophet who founded the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra's goal, presented in a series of aphorisms, is to prepare for the coming of the Übermensch, or Overman, who will fill the vacuum left by the death of the Christian God and the absence of real human heroes. Human life will be created as artists create their works.
What was the influence of logical atomism?
As a philosophical doctrine, logical atomism was surpassed by logical positivism. However, its main rhetorical force did demolish what Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, termed logical holism, or the notion that the world is a whole, no part of which can be known independently of all others. Logical holism was the epistemological doctrine associated with absolute idealism.
How were alchemists regarded by their peers?
Alchemists were regarded with suspicion by traditional thinkers and theologians. But their constant experimentation with metals and plant stuff resulted in discoveries useful in tanning, dyeing, metallurgy, and other so-called Baconian sciences. The figure of the magus, or wise man, or sorcerer, or even warlock, was associated with alchemy throughout its history. The science of modern chemistry had its early experimental roots in alchemy, which some think is the main reason why it was not accepted as part of the scientific curriculum in higher learning until well into the 19th century. The theory behind alchemy was Neoplatonic. Its main principle, as above, so below, meant that man was a microcosm of the cosmos. In addition, time was believed to be cyclical, and the universe was seen as a being that is alive with divine spirit.
How did Hobbes explain sensation, memory, imagination, thought, and emotion?
Hobbes described sensations as effects of movement in the body that are felt through the motions of the heart. Sense always has some memory adhering to it, because sense organs retain the movements of external bodies acting on them. So long as the organs are moved by one object, they cannot be moved by another. Imagination is decaying sense, after the source of sensation is removed. And memory is similar to imagination, except that it also has a feeling of familiarity. Hobbes believed that thought involved literal movements in the head. His idea of unguided thought led to later theories of the association of ideas. That one thought automatically evokes another in the mind. Guided thought is goal-directed. Hobbes thought that while humans and animals both may perform the action that is necessary to reach a goal, only humans have the distinctive trait of prudence. Prudence involves beginning with the action that one can perform, and then calculating its consequences as a guide for what to do. Prudence increases with experience. Concerning the passions, or emotions, which he called endeavors, Hobbes postulated two types of motion in the body: vital motions, such as breathing, nutrition, and the circulation of the blood, and animal motion, such as voluntary movement. Pleasure is nothing more than motion around the heart. Appetite is an endeavor toward an object associated with pleasure. And aversion is an endeavor away from it.
What did Anne Conway's physical pain have to do with her philosophy and religion?
Anne was born December 14, 1630, a week after her father. Sir Henry Finch, who was Speaker of the House of Commons, died. Having learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew at home, she began a correspondence with Henry More. 1614 to 1687, who had been her brother's tutor at Christ College. More held her in very high intellectual esteem, and their correspondence continued after she married Edward Conway. At the age of 20, More wrote of her that he had scarce ever met with any person, man or woman, of better natural parts than Lady Conway. One of her motivations for studying philosophy and possibly converting to Quakerism was her need to reconcile the existence of a good, all-powerful God with pain and suffering in the world. Anne herself was afflicted with extraordinarily severe headaches all her life. At one point, she had her jugular arteries bled in search of relief.
What was Edmund Husserl's doctrine of intentionality?
Husserl thought that the same objectivity of intentional objects that mathematical symbols have holds for all sorts of other objects, as well, including objects of perception and categorical objects, such as causal connections, states of affairs, and relations. When we describe an object, we have an intellectual intuition of it, or our intention is fulfilled. Although in terms of what we do not know, our intention of the object may be empty. At first, Husserl thought that what was given to us in consciousness was not the Kantian thing in itself. But he later claimed that in a manifold of appearances, the thing in itself can be given to consciousness, which is to say, known. This view was criticized as idealism because all objects for Husserl were objects of consciousness. Husserl later qualified his position by stating that the thing in itself given to consciousness was only given to consciousness as a complete object of consciousness, not as its own total reality. Basically, Husserl was claiming that everything we know, even if what we know is true, is nonetheless something like an idea in the mind, e.g., my cat is now sitting on my computer as I write this. That's a fact. But as something that I am consciously aware of, it is also something in my mind.
Who was Pierre-Simon Laplace's most famous student?
The man who would later become the most famous French dictator in history, Napoleon Bonaparte, was one of Laplace's students. Laplace's definitive analytic theory of probabilities, 1812, was, in fact, dedicated to Napoleon.
What were Martin Heidegger's views on death?
Heidegger thought that the individual's death had to be wrested away from the they, who made of death something impersonal that was ordinary, but which somehow didn't happen to anyone in particular. Heidegger claimed that death is in each case my own and that authentic existence requires an attitude of anticipatory resoluteness toward one's own death. It is nothing less than conscience, the call of care, which draws a person to attend to his or her own death. The problem is that Dasein cannot be completed until Dasein is no more. But when Dasein is no more, Dasein will no longer be as a concrete individual. And furthermore, its own death is a nothing. Heidegger took this to mean that we are constantly being called to a nullity, in a paradoxical need to authentically be that which we most fully are. This nullity in the essence of Dasein, which in Heidegger's terminology is always outstanding. So long as Dasein is, creates a primordial anxiety in Dasein. Heidegger meant that the fact that our death is always in the future is what makes us always anxious. But of course, if our death were in the present, we would no longer exist. So we mortals have to put up with the fact that we will die as something that we are always aware of while we are alive.
What was Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism?
Most professional philosophers refer to Rand's 1905 to 1982 objectivism as a so-called philosophy. Rand claimed to have taught herself the history of Western philosophy in a matter of months, which left her a passionate follower of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE. She believed that Aristotle's law of identity, or A is a metaphysical principle on which can be based the existence of an objective world that is knowable through reason. Rand remains popular on many contemporary college campuses, although more for her novels and doctrine of selfishness than for her metaphysics. Most professional philosophers before and after Rand have held A to be a tautology, telling us nothing about the world, be it objective or otherwise.
What was Franz Brentano's psychological theory of right and wrong?
Brentano thought that judgments can be correct or incorrect and that the same held for loving and hating. If a thing is good, then it is impossible to love it incorrectly. Correctness in loving and hating is objective, as is incorrectness. Brentano was an intuitionist concerning such correctness. He thought that we could be immediately and directly aware of the fit between the emotion and the object. 1859 to 1938, the founder of phenomenology, and Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, the father of psychoanalysis. He was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest in 1864. but renounced his vows after engaging in a dispute about papal infallibility. He resigned his professorship at the University of Vienna, so that he could marry, and was not able to regain that position. Later years left him blind. But he continued to write in virtually every subfield of philosophy until he died. Brentano's principal writings are psychology from an empirical point of view. 1874, and our knowledge of the origin of right and wrong, 1889.
What were the common themes of the Enlightenment?
The common themes were a set of values that included the following. Imbuing all other values was the importance of reason and its uses to discover ideal forms of human nature and society. The belief in the natural goodness of man, which was to be rediscovered by the reform of corrupt institutions. An overall secularity and downplaying of traditional Christian transcendence. A new aesthetic and ethics based on the goodness of nature. Perhaps most important, a great faith in progress or the belief that the present is better than the past and that the future will be better than the present. Nevertheless, none of the paramount Enlightenment thinkers simply played out these themes in direct ways. They almost all used reason or rational thought together, with a fair amount of wit to propound and develop their ideas. The ideas themselves, though, sometimes had unforeseen consequences. That is, often the Enlightenment geniuses went too far, or were not able to fully think things through. As a result, skepticism, pessimism, and romantic madness took over when the ideas of progress and the ideals of human reason ran out.
What is environmentalism?
Environmentalism is the study of the relationship between living organisms, including human beings, and natural environments, usually with the aim of preserving natural environments and renewable resources. Environmentalism is now a multifaceted, multidisciplinary field, extending widely into both theory and practice. Environmental philosophy has drawn on many traditions and subfields within philosophy, including ethics, social philosophy, continental philosophy, aesthetics, and feminism. Each of these areas refers basic questions about our relation to the environment to fundamental philosophical viewpoints.
How did A. J. defeat Mike Tyson?
This is an oft-told story that those who knew Ayer said sounded exactly like him. When, at the age of 77, Ayer was a visiting professor at Bard College in 1987. He went to a party hosted by fashion designer Fernando Sanchez. Air noticed that the professional heavyweight boxer Mike Tyson was annoying model Naomi Campbell. Air told Tyson to back off, and Tyson responded, "Do you know who the fuck I am? I'm the heavyweight champion of the world." Air shot back, "And I am the former Wickham professor of logic. We are both preeminent in our field. I suggest that we talk about this like rational men." Air and Tyson did have a conversation, and Naomi Campbell, who was not yet famous, took advantage of this diversion to elude them both. What was AJ?
What did Francis Bacon contribute to the scientific revolution?
Francis Bacon, 1561–1626, systematized the methodology of empirical science and set forth a program for how science could better human life. He is famous for claiming, "Knowledge is power," and sought ways to further develop and apply the new sciences to human life in practical ways. He believed that human beings needed to master nature and conduct experiments to discover her secrets. 20th century feminists were to take Bacon to task for his assignment of a female gender to nature, compared to the maleness of scientists who were charged to conquer it.